In 1808, the Cape Colony was in flux. A remote imperial outpost that was nevertheless fundamental to British global designs, the Cape Colony was caught between European wars and home to a brutal system of slavery that had lasted for generations. Britain had seized it once, lost it, and taken it back again. But as the empire tightened its grip, another force was stirring. That of revolution. Slavery had been entrenched at the Cape for centuries, but the revolutionary spirit of the age could not be contained. Inspired by whispers of rebellion from across the Atlantic, emboldened by the recent abolition of the slave trade, and led by a man named Louis van Mauritius, a group of enslaved people rose up against their oppressors in one of South Africa's most remarkable acts of resistance. Tonight, we uncover the story of the 1808 Cape Colony Revolt. What sparked it? How did the rebels plan and execute their uprising? How did the British react to this challenge to their authority? And what, if anything, is the legacy of enslaved resistance in South Africa today? This is 1808, Rebellion at the Cape. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod.
Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are talking about a revolt. Not people being revolting, but a revolt that, frankly, you've probably never heard of. I am reliably informed by my provost marshal that there's no Wikipedia page for this. So if you're expecting to sort of go and find the fundamentals on Wikipedia and then expand your knowledge, well, no, folks. You're just going to have to sit down and listen to the whole thing. We are joined by Nigel Worden, Emeritus Professor at the University of Cape Town and a world-leading authority on the history of colonial South Africa. He has a vast range of books out there on things like colonialism, slavery, and the city of Cape Town. And we will put a link in the description to enable you to get to those as quickly and simply as possible. But you might particularly want to avail yourself with The Making of Modern South Africa, which is available from Blackwell's. Nigel, welcome to the show. It's your Napoleonic Wars pod debut. Nice to see you. How are you doing?
Thank you. Good to be with you.
I notice you're in a very, very sunny part of the world, which, considering we are shivering in sort of 1 degree heat, is making me somewhat jealous. You're coming to us, I gather, somewhere in South Africa. Is that right?
That's it. Yes, I'm here in Cape Town, and it's the middle of our summer in this hemisphere, of course. So yes, I'm sitting here with the air conditioner on, just to make you all jealous.
Yeah, that worked very, very effectively. Also joining me, perhaps shivering in his student accommodation, perhaps not. I don't know if they actually turn the heating on, where Josh resides, but Josh Redden is once again in the house, the estimable Provost Marshal, the wielder of the musket, following his recent exploits, being trained by our quartermaster, Mr. Telfer. Stay tuned for that video, which will drop soon. How are you doing, Josh?
I'm doing very well, although, as you say, it is absolutely Baltic in the UK at the moment, and I'm jealous of Nigel, with the South African heat, or maybe at least jealous of him with the heat plus the aircon. That would be nice.
Yeah, you wouldn't want heat without the aircon, would you? You know, I feel this is a sort of terribly British conversation that we're sort of ending up having. You know, we like a bit of heat, but not too much heat. You know, too much heat would be uncivilized. You know, we can't have that. Right, let's get on with it. Let's get down to business, which we're actually doing inside 3 minutes, which is probably a record.
That's remarkable
for this show. And we're going to sort of contextualize ourselves because this revolt takes place in Cape Town, which hopefully folks are familiar with, is in present-day South Africa. But in 1808, Cape Town is the capital of the Cape Colony, which was then a fairly new addition. Addition kind of sounds sort of less underhand than I feel sort of the British are when they come to acquiring land across the world. But let's call it a new addition to the British Empire. Give us some context, Nigel, by kind of talking us through what happened in South Africa during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and how the Cape Colony ends up being in British hands through some, I would say, pretty dastardly and realpolitik-esque means.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Zach, indeed. But just to give a little bit of context here, the Cape Colony had been under the control of the Dutch, of course, for a long time, from the middle of the 17th century, under the control of the Dutch East India Company, the trading company. But by the late 18th century, I mean, by the time of the Revolutionary Wars, the Dutch East India Company was in a dire state. It was in a right mess. It had lost control over a lot of the trade that it had previously had in the Indian Ocean world, and it was especially undercut really by the English East India Company, the British East India Company, which had established itself quite firmly by this time in India. And the British and the Dutch were no friends. I mean, they were at open war with each other in the 1780s. So during the 1790s, when the Revolutionary Wars were taking place, French troops actually occupied the Netherlands, occupied the Dutch Republic, and captured the Dutch Navy as well. So the Dutch Navy, the Dutch nation, came really under the control of revolutionary France. And the Dutch Republic actually declared war again on Britain. So it was open conflict between the Dutch and the British in this period, and the Dutch under French alliance and French control, really. So the British then, in effect, during this period of conflict, occupied the Cape, took it over, sent a navy to the Cape, fought a brief battle here in Table Bay, in Cape Town, and took over the colony directly. There was that was in 1795. There was a brief period when it returned to Dutch rule, just for a couple of years in the early 19th century, 1803. But then it was recaptured again by the British in 1806. And there was another naval battle. You know, the British, of course, in this period, as we know, in the Napoleonic Wars, it was the navy that really was their strength. And another naval battle here in Table Bay, they recaptured the colony. So it really was an outcome of the conflicts between Britain and France's occupied territories in continental Europe that spread through to the colonies and to the Cape. So the British then took over the Cape, and it was a period of great political uncertainty and upheaval. But the Cape was finally ceded permanently to Britain in 1814. And then the Treaty of Vienna, that of course ended the Napoleonic Wars, 1815, finally confirmed British control over the Cape. And that was to lead to British control over all the wider South Africa in the course of the 19th century, as the British took over more and more land and conquered more and more territory. So it's a very tumultuous period, really, in the history of the Cape, and there's a great deal of conflict and uncertainty about what's going on during this period.
Nigel, we were talking a little bit before the episode about the fact that kind of South Africa is quite peripheral to popular understanding of kind of the revolutionary and Napoleonic period. It's probably quite peripheral to my understanding as well. But thinking about South Africa geographically, and especially the Cape, it is obviously in a geopolitically important position in terms of being a route to India, which we do associate more with the revolutionary periods. So how did South Africa figure in terms of kind of the bigger picture of the British Empire and its global strategy? Because it seems to me it would be pretty important, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. We often tend to think of the revolutionary Napoleonic period as being essentially a European historical force, but actually the upheavals of that period were truly global. They didn't just affect Europe. And the impact of the conflict that I was saying between France and Britain in particular resonated in their colonies, throughout their colonies. Um, uh, so, for instance, the French colony in Mauritius, the French colony in Haiti or Saint-Domingue were very, very directly affected by what was going on in France and in Europe. Um, I think you're absolutely right, though, about the Cape. The Cape was not a profitable colony to the Dutch or to later on to Britain in the way that, say, the Caribbean sugar plantations were. It wasn't a great export colony, but its importance was strategic. It was geographical, and I think particularly. Remember, this is after the British have lost their American colonies. So the world that was the earlier British Empire of the 17th and early 18th centuries, which focused on the Atlantic, on the Americas, this has really been severely undercut by the American Revolution. And Britain is now, if it's going to continue expanding its empire or benefiting from an empire, it's looking more and more to India and to the Indian Ocean. Still got the Caribbean colonies, but it's very concerned about the Indian Ocean. And there's a letter which the governor of the Cape, when they first took it over in the 1790s, wrote back to the colonial office in London, and I think it just sums up why the Cape was important, because he says in this letter, the Cape's importance to us arises from its geographical position, from its forming the master link of connection between the Western and the Eastern world, from it being the great outwork of our Asiatic commerce and our Indian empire. And above all, we have to, from the conviction we have to have, that if it falls into the hands of a powerful enemy, it might enable him to shake to the foundation, perhaps overturn and destroy the whole fabric of our Oriental opulence and dominion. Now, this is very lofty language, of course, coming from the governor, but I think it reflects the key fact that they see the Cape as being absolutely essential to defending and strengthening their position in the Indian Ocean. You have to remember, of course, this is before the Suez Canal is built, so the only way to get to the Indian Ocean from Britain is round the Cape, is round here. And it's notable, I think, that British interests are certainly in India, but also elsewhere in the Indian Ocean. They're very interested in the spice trade in Southeast Asia, which the Dutch had controlled. Now the British want to take that over. They remember also they've just established convict colonies in Australia, in New South Wales and in Tasmania. 1780s, 1803 in Tasmania. So it's all going on at this time that the Indian Ocean world, Australia and India, are really crucial to British interests. And in fact, when the Treaty of Vienna finally confirmed British control over the Cape, they also gave to Britain Mauritius, Ceylon, or now Sri Lanka, the area of Java, which was to develop around the port of Singapore later. These are key nodal points for navies and for trading vessels into the Indian Ocean world. And in fact, in the 19th century, the Indian Ocean and the lands around it, many of them come under European colonial control, and the dominant power there is definitely Britain. So the Cape then has a really significant role in that. And I think in the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, the British felt that if it fell under French control, particularly the great enemy France, then it would be very, very dangerous to British interests in the Indian Ocean world.
This taps really neatly into a long-standing debate about Britain's sort of strategic priorities in times of war. Particularly usually kind of focused upon the West Indies and this idea that British strategy in any conflict over the course of the 18th century is let's send some troops off to the Caribbean and we'll see some sugar islands and we can use those as bargaining chips because they are so valuable.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of debate about the extent to which there is a pivot over the course of the Napoleonic Wars from let's go and use these islands as bargaining chips, to let's just keep these islands, partly perhaps because they're not valuable enough to be able to use as sort of exciting and valuable assets to dangle in front of your enemy, and use them as leverage on the negotiating table when the French are marching as far as Vienna, or annexing northern Italy, or whatever it might be. The balance just doesn't play out there. But there is also this different focus, to my mind at least, in the sense that Britain isn't just looking at the Western Hemisphere. Britain is looking at everything that's got some sea attached to it, fundamentally, as a place where they might be able to garner leverage and expand, partly under the sort of the guise of trade, but also sort of in that sort of interest of just controlling more areas and expanding areas of influence. So where do you sit on this, and how do you see South Africa kind of playing into this? Because I must admit, I have a much more cynical view of how Britain acts during this period. And folks can kind of hear that in that first question that I asked you about sort of realpolitik and dastardly means. Britain sort of steps in, takes over these places, whilst they're either sort of in this state of flux because they're losing a bit of control and influence from their metropole, because the French are marching in and sort of establishing new systems of government. And then sort of at the end of the war kind of goes, well, what are you going to do about it? We hold it. You got the means to take it back? No, you haven't, have you? No, I didn't think so. So we'll be keeping South Africa, or the Cape Colony as it was then. And that's very much my read of it. But where do you stand on this?
Yeah, well, I think I'm equally cynical from the perspective of a South African. I mean, the of course, where the British are doing this par excellence is in India. Where they've been talking about, well, we're just there as traders, and oh yes, we'll help the Mughals out with a bit of tax collecting, and then whoops, oh, we're actually in control of Bengal. I mean, it's absolutely the way they're behaving in India. Um, and I think there are two things. I think one is, it's definitely the case that they are aware of the economic advantages as well as the strategic and political ones of certainly of India. In the Indian Ocean as well, Mauritius. I mean, Mauritius is the classic, or becomes certainly the classic slave-based sugar plantation colony in the way the Caribbean was. The South Africa, or rather the Cape, is, because we must talk about the Cape, it's not yet South Africa. The Cape is rather different from that in that it really doesn't have much economic advantage at this stage. And that's why I was stressing the sort of the strategic issues rather than the economic ones. But I think you're quite right. I mean, once they've got here, they're certainly not going to give it up. And the thing about the Cape is that it was both the sort of the link between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean world, but of course also it was the entry into the hinterland of Southern Africa. At this stage, they were interested. The British were interested, as the Dutch had been, in developing some agriculture here, a settler economy. But of course, for the British, it was when they discovered minerals and diamonds and later on gold in South Africa that they realised that they got a plum, and the Cape was then the basis of expansion into the whole of South Africa. So I share your approach here. I share your attitude there, Zach. I think you're right, and I think also, of course, it's the Napoleonic period that makes the British so aware of how important their navy was and how important their maritime control was. And as we know from this period, it was essentially the victories were it was the naval control or the blockades that really gave the British so much advantage. We all think about Waterloo, but actually we should be thinking more about maritime issues, I think. So ports, seaports, and coastal stations like the Cape were significant, I think, to a nation which was flexing its muscles very much in maritime issues.
I'd like to ask a question about slavery in the Cape, because while Britain first takes over the colony in 1795, slavery has a much longer history there. And when we think of the Atlantic slave trade, there's a tendency to imagine it as this kind of triangular trade with Africans being displaced to the Americas. But that's not always the case. I mean, in many instances, and in this one, Africans were being displaced elsewhere in Africa. So can you kind of fill us in a little bit more on the nature of slavery in the Cape Colony? How many enslaved people were there? Where are they from originally? And what kind of labor are they being forced into doing?
Right, right. Well, you're quite right. We tend normally, when we talk about colonial slavery in this period, to think of the Atlantic world and the transatlantic slave trade. But actually, the trade in human beings, the enslavement of human beings, was as widespread in the Indian Ocean as it was in the Atlantic world. And indeed, there's been a lot of interest and study more recently on this, and showing that the numbers of enslaved people in the Indian Ocean world may have been as large indeed as they were in the Americas. Um, Now, the Cape fits into this Indian Ocean world, not Atlantic. And that's because it was controlled by the Dutch East India Company, not the West India Company. The Dutch West India Company was involved in the Atlantic slave trade in Suriname and across the Atlantic world from West Africa. But the East India Company was forbidden from participating in that trade in people, and instead they turned to the Indian Ocean sources of enslaved people. Um, I mean, the question may be asked, why do they need slaves at all? And the answer to that is they wanted to establish a provision colony, an area which would provide food for passing ships. And the local population, when they arrived at the Cape, had been pretty much decimated, both by the attacks that they made on them and by, as so often happens with colonial control, by the introduction of diseases, which smallpox particularly, which more or less wiped out the local population. So they drew on the enslaved people of the world that they've been in contact with in the Indian Ocean. And slaves came from a variety of places to the Cape, captured by or traded by the East India Company, India especially, the Bay of Bengal region, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, especially what is now Indonesia, the islands of Southeast Asia. So a lot of the enslaved people at the Cape were from India and Southeast Asia, not from Africa. But there were also people brought from, enslaved people brought from particularly Madagascar, where the Dutch East India Company at the Cape sent trading vessels to Madagascar, slave trading vessels to Madagascar. Also, particularly later on in the 18th century, from the area that's now Mozambique, along the southeast African coast and from the interior of that. Um, Not themselves capturing people from the interior, but trading in people in trading posts along the African coast. So the enslaved population at the Cape is a mixture of people from across Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Madagascar, and Mozambique, the southeastern Africa. Numbers, there were about at the time of this revolt, there were about 32,000 enslaved people at the Cape. So it's not as huge as the big plantation slave colonies in the Caribbean. But there were also as many enslaved people as there were settler colonists. So it really was a slave society, and had been really throughout the Dutch period, and continued so after the British took over. They were scattered throughout the colony, enslaved people, but the majority were either living and working in Cape Town itself, where they worked on the docks, in households, in the settler households in the town. They worked for the East India Company and later on for the British when they took over on heavy labor work, for instance, quarrying in the stone quarries around the town. And then there were also a number of enslaved people working on the grain and wine farms of the hinterland of Cape Town, um, the area we call the Southwestern Cape, which was arable. And they were working on farms there, not huge plantations, grain farms, wine farms. Most farms had slave labor and usually had between perhaps 5, 10, 15 enslaved people on each farm. So they're not large plantations, but there are concentrations of slaves in Cape Town and in its hinterland area, and the British take that over. The British, when they do take over, it's just at the time of the rise of the abolitionist movement in Britain. And the result of that is that the British Parliament does stop the slave trade in 1806. And that's implemented at the Cape in 1807. So they stop the importation of slaves, of slave people, and therefore but they don't stop slavery itself. So the colony is still very dependent on enslaved labor, and those in future children born to enslaved women are also enslaved. So the process of continuing of slavery continues even after the slave trade has ended.
I want to talk about the influence of ideas within all of this. Folks who've listened to this show or the Napoleonic Quarterly will know that revolutionary ideas are swirling all over the place during this period, particularly having an influence in contributing to the insurrection in Saint-Domingue. And so therefore, these ideas aren't just limited to fundamentally sort of colonial white powers, whether they're in Europe or North America. So how much impact, I guess, is revolutionary spirit having in the Cape Colony, both before and after and during sort of this phase where you have British occupation, then return to Dutch control, and then reoccupation by the British?
Oh, very strong indeed. I mean, you put your finger on what I think is the key issue here. News about what was going on in this revolutionary period, in both in Europe and in the Caribbean, spread very widely and rapidly, and it particularly spread through the seaports, through word being brought about what was going on by naval crews ships coming into the harbours, and people learning as a result what was happening. And we know absolutely. I mean, the Cape was a nodal point. It was a port where ships were coming and going all the time from the Atlantic world and from the Indian Ocean world. And we know that in Cape Town itself, the news of, for instance, of the naval uprisings and mutinies at Spithead and at the Nore in the 1790s, they knew about that at the Cape, certainly. And indeed, there were naval mutinies in Table Bay, in Cape Town itself, which were really following on from what had been happening in England. So that was well known about. The Haitian slave revolt you mentioned, Saint-Domingue, that was also known about, and we'll see shortly. I think that had a big influence on many of the enslaved people in the Cape. They also knew about, for instance, about the Irish uprising and revolt of the 1790s. They knew about the conflicts going on in Mauritius, and that was between slave owners and the French revolutionary government when it took over. They knew that the revolutionary government in France had abolished slavery completely in 1794, although it was reimposed again by Napoleon. So they were well aware of what was going on in the world. And we can see that in all sorts of ways. I mean, I spent some time looking through complaints made by enslaved people to the government in the 1790s, and it's really revealing the kind of language that they use. They use the language of human rights. which comes out of this revolutionary period. They talk about the right to speak, the right to rest, the right not to be severely punished. Now, this is very new kind of language. It's new kind of language, a sense of human rights coming out of the revolutionary period in Europe, but it's reflected very much here as well amongst the enslaved people. I mentioned the mutinies of the Navy here that took place actually in Table Bay, so that the population of Cape Town would have been well aware of that and of what was going on. Also, just to mention, I said the British took over the Cape again in 1806 in a naval battle. That battle was fought right in Table Bay, actually at place near some of the farms in the hinterland of Cape Town, the area known as Blauberg. So the people on those farms would have been watching this battle taking place. They knew that the world was in upheaval and it was taking place here. And then there's just one other thing which I think is really significant for the revolt we're going to be talking about, and that is that when the British took over in 1806, and the slave trade was abolished in that year and implemented in the following year, the British authorities, the new British authorities here at the Cape, carried out investigations into what they suspected, and they suspected quite rightly, were illegally imported enslaved people. They checked up on the new enslaved people who were in the colony as to where they had come from, where they had been brought from, and they discovered that a number of them had been smuggled into the colony by private traders after the slave trade had officially been abolished. And in fact, they investigated several farms in this regard, and over 100 people were actually freed because they had been illegally imported into the colony. So it's a ferment going on, obviously widely in the world at this stage, but it's very much reflected in what people here at the Cape knew about the events elsewhere, but also what was physically going on right here under their noses. And I think it's very, very clear. So the sense that change is in the air, there's a belief that some of the slave owners, some of the colonists were actually acting illegally. They were denying slaves their rights. They were denying the abolition of the trade. So it's a moment of heightened, as you said, revolutionary spirit at the Cape as much as elsewhere, I think.
We spare no expense on this show setting the scene, but it's probably high time to actually talk about the 1808 Cape Colony revolt. You clearly emphasize the importance of kind of revolutionary ideas and revolutionary spirit in causing it, but there must have also been kind of other catalysts, reasons that the revolt broke out in the way it did in 1808. You mentioned there kind of the British reoccupation of the colony and also the abolition of the slave trade. So there's clearly things going on in the build up to 1808. So would you mind kind of weaving all these things together and painting a picture for us of how all this discontent becomes quite a big revolt?
Oh, right. Well, we can pin it down to a very, very specific event, a meeting, actually, a meeting which took place in the best places where news travels and information gets communicated in a pub, in a tavern along the dockside here in Cape Town in 1808, and it was a meeting between an enslaved man, a man called Louis, who had originally, as a young child, been brought from Mauritius. So we call him Louis of Mauritius, and he met in this tavern two Irishmen who were really drifting at this stage and had ended up in Cape Town. One of them, a man called James Hooper, was in his mid-20s. He'd arrived in Cape Town because he'd worked as a servant to a ship's captain, and he'd worked in Portsmouth. Significantly, he'd been at Spithead, so he would have known all about the naval mutiny there. He'd also been in India. He'd been linked to the United Irishmen movement, which was calling for freedom from England in Ireland. And the other man was a man called Michael Kelly, also Irish. He'd been with the East India Company in India, and he was also in Cape Town at this stage, drifting around. Well, the significance of the meeting was that these two Irishmen talked to Louis about slavery, and we presume that Louis was telling them that he himself was a slave. And they said to him, and I quote here from the words that Louis said they said to him. They said, "There are no slaves in our country," that being in Ireland, "neither in England or in Scotland or in America." Now, it's interesting that they say that. I mean, they're talking about these countries in Britain. Ireland, I mean, some of the Irish who've been objecting to British rule may well have thought they were enslaved to the British, but they weren't legally slaves in that sense. He talks about England and Scotland. You know, this is the new countries that have just taken over the Cape. Louis would have been interested in, who are these countries? What goes on there? And then he says there are no slaves in America. Well, he obviously got that wrong. But it's interesting, actually, because he'd been in the Navy, and I suspect that his knowledge of America was mainly the northern ports, places like Boston, rather than the plantation south. But anyway, the point is that he'd said to Louis, "What are you doing being a slave here? You know, we don't have slaves in our parts of the world." And Louis then was taken aback by this and said, "Well, you know, I've heard that in other countries, all people are free. But there are so many people here, black people here," he said, "who could also be free. So we ought to be free as well. We ought to fight for our freedom. Oh, enough of this. Let's get our freedom." So this meeting with these two guys who were part of this naval world of ferment and mutiny and revolutionary feelings, Irishmen nochal, who were part of the revolutionary movement in Ireland, these really set the tinder to the flame, and Louis was so outraged to hear that he believed that they'd been unjustly kept in slavery. I mean, it's confirmed perhaps by the fact the slave trade had been abolished. The government at the Cape was investigating illegal slaving. You know, it's not surprising that Louis thought that they were illegally and unjustly being kept as slaves. So the result of all of this was that Louis went with one of his friends, companions, another enslaved person, actually a runaway slave, together with these two Irishmen. And they went to a farm just outside Cape Town. And incidentally, it was one of the farms where this investigation into illegal slave trading had taken place. And they went to this farm, and two things happened there. First of all, the farmer was away when they arrived, but they pretended that they were visitors. Louis was quite light-skinned. He was perhaps a mulatto. And the two Irishmen introduced him to the farmer's wife, who was at home, as being a visiting Spanish captain. And she, you know, great hospitality, offered him dinner. So they spent the night there. They sat and had wine and food that she provided them, thinking that they were outside guests. But the point about this was that this was the farm where Louis and his fellows had planned to start the uprising. The other enslaved man there went to the slaves on the farm, told them that they were going to march back to Cape Town, demand their rightful freedom. They were going to get all the slaves together from the farms, and they were then going to march to Cape Town and get their freedom. So this was how the revolt began. It began directly as a result of the connections made in the wider world, but it took a particular form in relation to the upheavals that were taking place in the Cape Colony itself.
You've given us some teasers there about Louis's background. There's also a clue, I guess, in his name, Louis van Mauritius. How much do we know about this guy and his life and sort of the journey towards becoming a leader amongst the rebels? What it's that classic thing. What do we know about this guy? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, Louis is a very, very intriguing person. He was a very, very unusual enslaved man at the Cape. He'd come. We say came from Mauritius. We know that he came as a very young child from Mauritius. He was probably only about 4 or 5, and that tells you something about the fact that children were being enslaved as well. Um, uh, but the interest about Louis is that he was owned by a female Cape Town colonist, and he had a rather unusual kind of adolescence and youth. His owner, a woman called Maria Grove, gave him some education. Um, uh, he converted, or he became Christian, which was unlike many of the enslaved people at the Cape, many of whom were actually Muslim, and also hired him out when he got older, when he was a teenager, hired him out to work with a freed slave woman, a woman called Anna, with whom he formed a permanent relationship. And in fact, in the trial records, he describes Anna as his wife. Um, Slaves were not legally allowed to marry, but permanent relationships were often referred to as partnerships, as husbands and wives. So Louis was still enslaved, but he was in a relationship, a permanent relationship with a free woman, Anna, and he actually moved with her into her home, which was close to the harbour, the docks in Cape Town. And he was helping out in her brother's wine shop, which is where he met these Irishmen. So he's not your everyday enslaved person working in the quarries or on a farm. He's got a degree of, I was going to say freedom, inverted commas. He's got a degree of control over what he's doing in his life, which was greater than that of many other enslaved people, although he's still, of course, actually legally enslaved. And he has connections, very close connections, with the relatively sizable free black community in Cape Town. These were people who had bought their way out of slavery or had been freed by their owners, which sometimes had happened, and they were mainly in Cape Town. And he was part of that world of the free slave community in Cape Town. He may have had a particular grievance, therefore, that he wasn't free. And when he met these Irish guys who were saying, look, you should all be free, this must have really resonated with Louis, who'd been living in this world with free people a great deal, and whose wife was part of it. So I think his decision to act was based also on his own personal circumstances, as well as the wider atmosphere and situation in the colony as a whole. You asked how it was he became the leader, and I think that's part of the explanation, that he's got contact with this other world, this world that is not the world only of the enslaved. But how he asserted his leadership is really very interesting indeed. He spent a while before they went off to this farm. They spent several weeks while Louis was getting together a particular uniform that he insisted on wearing, and he was very fussy about this uniform. He had to have white linen trousers, he had to have a blue jacket, it had to have a red collar, it had to have golden epaulets. He wanted to have a particular sword. He especially needed a hat, a triangular hat, and it had to have feathers on it. Now, you read all of this and you think, well, was Louis just a fashion freak? I mean, why was he so concerned to get this exact uniform to be looking exactly like this? And then you come across the print that was made and circulated widely at this time of the leader of the Haitian Saint-Domingue slave revolt, Toussaint Louverture. And what is Toussaint wearing? Exactly that. It's an exact copy of Toussaint's uniform. So Louis never, in his trial, he never actually says that. Mind you, if you're up for trial for your life, the last thing you would say is, well, I was copying the leader of the major slave rebellion in the Caribbean. You keep quiet about it. But it's absolutely apparent to me that this is what he was doing. And so I think he saw himself as the Cape Toussaint. He saw himself as the leader of the revolt, which had been so successful, and they knew that. They knew it had been successful in Saint-Domingue in Haiti. So I think he's asserting his leadership in terms of his own position in Cape Town, but also in resonance with what had been going on in the wider world.
I love that anecdote, and not just because it reminds me of one certain co-host of ours, Luke Reynolds, and how much thought that he puts into his own sartorial choices, but also because it shows how kind of the ideas that were circulating, this kind of revolutionary spirit, isn't just about the French Revolution. There's also kind of ideas and interchange between people like Louis van Mauritius looking at what's going on in the Caribbean and Haiti and taking inspiration from that rather than everything just emanating from Paris.
Yeah.
You've described that kind of that fateful meeting on the farm and all the preparation that takes place afterwards. How does the revolt kind of fan out from that point, and what is the British response to it?
Right. Well, it becomes very serious because this is a demand for the ending of slavery. It's not just a sort of running away or attacking your particular owner. It's a demand for a complete change in the whole social order. Um, what did Louis do? They went to this first farm that I described, and then they gathered the slaves, the enslaved people from that farm, and then they went on to a nearby farm, and then continued for 3 days around the farms of this grain producing area, which were relatively close to each other. And in each farm, Louis waved around a piece of paper in his hand, and he claimed that this was the authority given to him to claim their freedom. And he also said, and these words are, I think, particularly significant. He said many times at each farm they arrived at, he gathered the slaves together and he said, "Our aim is we're going to hoist the bloody flag and fight ourselves free." Now, the bloody flag is, of course, the red flag that was used by pirates in the Atlantic world. It was used in the Saint-Domingue slave revolt. It was used in the Nore mutiny in England. It links itself to the red cap of the French revolutionaries. So it's this signal of the fight for freedom. They mean what they're about. This is the use of force. It's not just a little peaceful movement. So the hoisting of the bloody flag, they gathered the slaves from the farms. Many of the enslaved people on the farms believed that Louis had the authority to do this. He was waving this paper around. He had a very smart uniform, and also he adopted a strongly military style. And I think this is another thing about the fact this is taking place during the period of the Napoleonic Wars. He has uniforms, they have weapons. He insists that the leaders, the slaves from the different farms, the leaders of them, all ride on horseback. They take horses from the farms. And what do? They give orders. They appoint Louis appoints corporals to serve under him. And he presents this really as a military action, as a military coup. So the slaves who follow him really believe that this is a military action. They believe that Louis is justified in what he's doing, and word quickly spreads. So many of the enslaved people on the farms know that they're coming and are ready to join them. What about the slave owners? Well, the slave owners are absolutely terrified. They think, some of them, many of them, also that this is for real, that Louis has the authority to do this. After all, this is the new British government, and who would trust the British? I mean, what are they up to? And they're certainly not in favour of us, the old Dutch farmers. So many of the slave owners, I say, went along with it. They had no choice, but they didn't try and resist. And what Louis and the leaders of the revolt did when they got to a farm is they tied up the men, and they put them in wagons and said, "We're going to take you to Cape Town, and you're going to be we're going to make sure you leave the colony. We don't want you here anymore." They interestingly they left the women and children. It was very much a man's revolt, this, and they were focusing on the men on the farms. Um, but there are many things about the actions on the farms that I find absolutely fascinating. For one thing, they tied up the owners, but they didn't kill them. They didn't hit them. There was no overt violence of the sort that slave owners carried out quite often against slaves. Nobody died in this process. One woman was raped, and that was the most serious violence that took place. But Louis was furious when that happened, and punished the slave who'd done it. So it wasn't a violent uprising of this kind. But what they did do, and I think this reflects the fact that they firmly believed that they had the right to do this, they reversed the kinds of ways in which enslaved people and slave owners behaved. For instance, they demanded that they be given food on the farm and it be served to them by the owners, by the farmers, just as they had done that first night at the first farm. They threatened the owners. They made them get into the carts and got them tied up by threatening them with the whips that the slave owners themselves had used against the slaves. Some of the slave owners tried to run away, and the leaders of the revolt chased them and caught some of them and tied them up to the horses and made them trot in front of them back to the farm, which is exactly the way in which the slave owners and the authorities had caught runaway slaves in the past. There's one of the leaders, it wasn't Louis, it was one of the others, who said to one of the slaved women on one of the farms, "Oh, you don't need to speak respectfully to your owner anymore. You can call them yay." Now, this is the informal form of the word for you, which Dutch has the same as French and German. The difference between the formal and the informal word for you. Slaves, of course, were supposed to address their owners with very respectful, formal language. But this rebel was saying to them, "No, you don't need to be respectful to them anymore. Speak to them as ordinary people." So they really were asserting their rights as equals, or indeed as the rightful ones in this process. The revolt gathered altogether about over 300 enslaved people, about 340 altogether. And they then marched towards Cape Town. And then they met their match, because it was unfortunate for them that Cape Town was particularly strongly garrisoned at this point. The British had just taken it over. There was a whole detachment of troops in the town. And they immediately stopped the rebels just outside Cape Town and captured the leaders and arrested the rest of them. And so the revolt came to a very sudden end as a result. It's often said that it was a disaster, that it never got anywhere. And in one way, of course, that's true. They didn't achieve anything that they had planned or wanted to. But nonetheless, I think it did have significance in the end. And we'll talk a bit about that perhaps shortly.
I find this kind of completely intriguing, this feature of the revolt, the non-violent aspect of it. And it's something that, as far as I'm aware, must be pretty unique to this revolt, at least on that scale, in terms of the level of mercy or empathy from enslaved people. I mean, in other revolts, and I think quite justifiably, enslaved people would have been quite violent towards their former owners or those who claim to be their owners, in the way they had been violent to them. Why do you think that was? I mean, they had this information about other slave revolts going on in the Caribbean that turned out incredibly violently. So what was kind of why is the 1808 Cape Revolt different? I mean, what was it that made it so kind of peaceful, or made the enslaved people so so generous, I think, in their treatment.
Well, yeah. I mean, in a sense, it wasn't peaceful, I would say. I mean, they were overturning the order. They were tying people up and taking them into the town, etc. But it wasn't violent. I think that's the point. I think the reason for this is that it's what we've been saying, that Louis and those who followed him truly believed they were in the right. They weren't trying to get revenge on particular slave owners for the way they'd been treated in the past. In fact, although one has to be a bit perhaps cautious about this, but at their trial, all of them, or many of them, said, "Oh, we weren't badly treated by our owners." Well, maybe at the trial they would say that, but it wasn't that they were getting revenge, personal revenge for particular maltreatment. Um, and I think it was because they believed they were in the right. They believed that they had been unjustly kept in slavery, that once they got to Cape Town, the authorities would recognize this and would let them all go free and would get rid of the slave owners out of the colony. They really believed that they were doing the right thing. And I think, therefore, and it's marked by Louis's anger at the man who raped a woman. I think they really didn't want to be seen as aggressors, to be seen as acting unjustly. They wanted to be seen as the righteous ones, as the just ones. It is unusual. It's very different, of course, to what happened in Saint-Domingue and in some of the other colonies like Demerara, where there'd been a revolt as well, or in Mauritius. But I think the difference there was that in those colonies, the governments and the slave owners, who controlled largely the governments of those colonies, refused to allow the enslaved people any kind of freedom, and actively stood up against them. So I think we've got an unusual situation here, but one in which, as I say, Louis and his followers believe they are doing the right thing, and the right thing would not be to violently attack or murder or kill their owners.
It's a really interesting point there about sort of holding the moral high ground and I guess sort of wider perception. You know, if this is a non-violent movement, does that therefore reduce the perceived threat and it becomes a movement that is easier to negotiate with, is deemed to be more rational, and therefore might be treated more favorably? There's also a facet here that we haven't touched on, which is the native people who are living in and around the Cape Colony and the role that they have to play in the 1808 revolt.
Right. Well, the indigenous people of the colony, that is the San, who are hunter-gatherer people, the Khoi, who are pastoralists. This is not, by the way, the later contact that the British had with the settled farming communities of the Xhosa or the Zulu elsewhere in South Africa. They had really been decimated by the end of the 18th century by colonial rule. Many of them, I think we were saying earlier, many of them had either been killed by the actions of the conquerors, the colonial conquerors, or died of diseases, or indeed driven out of the colony. There were some who were working on farms as farm labourers. They were indentured farm labourers, but not very many. Certainly not in this area, the area around Cape Town and the grain farms nearby. We do know that a few Khoi people did join Louis in the march. But not very many. There had, by the way, been an earlier rebellion of Khoi people in the Eastern Cape, which was, much more a reaction against the oppression that they faced. But I think the key reason for this is not only were there not very many of them, but of course they weren't legally enslaved. I mean, they were certainly very badly treated and had lost their land and lost their cattle and were in effect treated and worked much in the same way as enslaved people did. But Louis's claims of freedom and the right to freedom didn't really apply to them in the same way as it did to the enslaved people on the farms. And I think this is another indicator that this wasn't a kind of revenge attack on the boss and the owner and the person who'd been making them work. It was a belief in just claims to freedom of enslaved people. So they were there, but they didn't play a significant part in this revolt. They were to in other forms of resistance in the northern and eastern Cape later on.
So you alluded to there kind of the process of the trials that happened afterwards, but I'd like to speak a little bit more about the fate of these people involved in the revolt afterwards. So what happened to these enslaved people when they were recaptured? And I mean, is it wishful thinking to think that they are shown the kind of mercy that they showed towards their capture, those they captured? Because I would expect no.
Well, I think your expectations would be met. Zach's point about, if this was, as it were, a moral crusade, did it make it easier for the authorities to be lenient, as it were? Yes and no is the answer to that. I mean, the leaders, Louis, the Irish guys, the rapist, the slave who had accompanied Louis, were all sentenced to death and were executed for rising up in rebellion against the authorities. So there was a very immediate reaction there. But what is perhaps interesting is that there were other leaders from the different farms who were also sentenced to death, which would have been absolutely the normal sentence for any slave who rebelled or stood up against their owner. But the governor of the Cape remitted the death sentence and instead sentenced them to imprisonment on Robben Island. So it wasn't exactly a freedom, but they weren't executed. But the key thing is all the other slaves. There were about 300 others who had been arrested. And these were not punished by the courts and by the authorities in Cape Town. Instead, they were returned to their owners. Now, some people have said, "Oh, this shows great leniency on the part of the government, and maybe does reflect the fact that they realized that the leaders of the revolt had misled many of the enslaved people, and it wasn't their fault," which, of course, is something they themselves said at the trial. Um, but I think there's another a reason here, which explains quite a lot of what went on. I said that on these farms, the world had kind of been turned upside down. The slaves had given the orders, the slave owners had to obey. The world had just been completely overturned. So what do you do to re-establish the order of the old world? You send the slaves back, and you send them back as slaves to their owners as owners, and you therefore make it very clear, both to the rebel slaves, enslaved people, and to their slave owners, that they got it wrong, that they can re-establish their authority. They could have punished their slaves, and I'm damn sure many of them did. There were very little controls of the amount of punishments that slave owners could give to their slaves. That did come a bit later, but at this stage, not. So I'd like to bet that those slave owners re-established their control and authority very directly. And another indication of this is that several months after this had all happened, a group of farmers, Dutch farmers, who had been from the farms that had come under attack, wrote to the governor, and they wrote a letter of thanks to the governor for having saved the colony and having salvaged the situation, and said how grateful they were to him for what he'd done. And in other words, they were very pleased with having order re-established. And what that did for the British, of course, was it meant that the British were now seen as being the protectors of the slave owners, and the Dutch farmers thought that the British were okay after all. So the British, I think, governor and the authorities, the British authorities in the Cape, I think played quite a cunning game by not directly punishing the slave rebels themselves, but sending them back to the farms, and they gained therefore the approval and more than approval, gratitude of those slave owners.
Yeah, I would agree with that interpretation entirely. In that sense of it's sending a dual message, isn't it? That this is an established order, and the British government affirms that established order. And if you are a slave owner, the British government will ensure that you are reinstated of your inverted commas property. Therefore, P.S. Please side with us. Please support us. Don't rise up in revolt. You know, accept the fact that we're in charge now because we look after you. But equally, if you're considering rising in revolt as a slave, well, you're going to end up straight back where you started. So, like, it's pointless. You are not going to win. And I suppose also it makes fewer martyrs, which perhaps is significant in this. Don't get me wrong, sure, executing people like Louis does create figureheads who can be martyrs. But if you make a martyr of the inverted commas ordinary slave, which is a term that we could kind of unpick in many terms in terms of its phraseology, but hopefully folks kind of know what I'm getting at with reference to that, then you're basically saying that everybody's going to be slaughtered or everybody's going to be enslaved. And so from the perspective of somebody who is enslaved, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. So you might as well just have a crack at freedom in order to see where it goes. Which I guess leads us to the legacies of this revolt, and what they are, but also kind of legacies for sort of slave resistance more generally in South African history.
Right, right. Um, I think just to get to that, one other point which really backs up what you've just been saying, Zach, and that is that, of course, also remember the slave trade has just been abolished. So getting sufficient labor to keep the farms going is not easy. And as I said, they've been controlling illegal importation of slaves, but they don't want to. They don't want to execute 300 people who would can be returned to work as labourers. So I think that really fits the interests of the owners absolutely. But to turn to your point about what the longer term legacy of this is, um, for a long time, first of all, let me say, in the colony for the next few decades, it's very clear that enslaved people were much more demanding of what they saw as their rights. They realized after the failure of this revolt, they realized that they didn't actually have freedom, but they demanded the right to fair treatment, the right to rest, not to be overworked, not to be severely punished, to be given adequate food, and also to be able to complain when owners didn't provide that. And the British did enable that to happen, complaints to be made. They set up an office, the Protector of Slaves office, where slaves could make these complaints. So, and we see more and more of them coming. And I think there's a situation here where I think it's the famous French historian Nathalie Zeman Davis made the point that you can turn the world upside down, but you can restore a world that's been turned upside down, rather, but it'll never be the same again. You know, the realization of what can be done or what should be done has grown. So there is a greater slave awareness of their rights and demands for them. There was another uprising, a smaller one in numbers, but perhaps more significant, in 1825, further away from Cape Town. And the interesting thing for us about that is that the rebels there overtly referred back to 1808. They talked about Louis and they talked about the revolt and they talked about the way that had been suppressed and oppressed and demanded that they be listened to, unlike the people in 1808. So what had happened in 1808 was very well known amongst both the enslaved of the colony and indeed the slave owners. So there was an awareness of that. But I think in the longer term, there's an issue here in South Africa, which is a bit of my hobby horse. So excuse me if I go on about it for a moment. And that is that the memory of enslavement and the resistance against slavery has really pretty much been forgotten here in South Africa. It's been submerged really by the more recent and perhaps one might say more significant uprisings and resistance against apartheid, which affected, of course, the whole population of the country. And slavery, enslavement of the form that it took at the Cape, has really not become a major feature of memory of resistance and of oppression in South Africa. It is beginning to be more widely known about. But of course, one of the reasons is that the situation of enslaved people at the Cape was not that of the indigenous black population of South Africa. And the stories of resistance and the great triumph of resistance against apartheid of the mid and late 20th century was not that of the descendants of the enslaved people of the Cape. It was that of the indigenous population of South Africa. It's very different to the situation, for instance, in the US, where the descendants of slaves are those who fight for civil rights and fight for equality. So, in some ways, the enslaved people here were outsiders. They weren't the indigenous. And it's the oppression of the indigenous black population of South Africa, which has been the essence of what has driven the forces of South African history. So it's not been widely known about, and I think there's time perhaps it was better known. I've been making a case. There's been a lot of street renaming in the country, of course. After the coming of democracy, we've got rid of all the old apartheid names, and we've got the heroes of the resistance in street names. And I've been arguing we really need a Louis van Mauritius Street here in Cape Town. But there is some growth and some awareness on it, and it's beginning to become more widely known about again now. And actually, if I may just finish by saying, this very week in mid-February of 2025. Is the 200th anniversary of the second revolt I spoke about, which took place in 1825. And I think tomorrow in Worcester, the town in the hinterland here, where the revolt took place, there is going to be a commemoration of that uprising. So it's not Louis' uprising, but it's certainly slave resistance, which we're commemorating here this week.
That's great to hear, Nigel. And I could honestly listen to you all day. You've been brilliant. Thank you once again for joining
I've
us.
not on so long, but thank you for your interest in this. It means a lot. It means a lot to me and to us here. Thank you.
Well, hopefully the listeners enjoyed learning something about kind of an area of Napoleonic inverted quotation history. That's what we tell them, to give them this kind of history. But hopefully they enjoyed kind of learning about something which needs, as you say, to be more thoroughly understood. Nigel Worden is Emeritus Professor at the University of Cape Town, and I would encourage you to check out his book, The Making of Modern South Africa, for a more general overview of South African history. It's published by Blackwell's, and you can find it in the description. Right, this has been the Napoleonic Wars podcast, and we will be back very soon.
Folks, do me a favor. Go review the show. Do it right now. 5 stars, please, and a comment. It takes you seconds, but it sends the algorithm wild and catapults us up the rankings. It's the single most powerful thing that you can do to support the hours of content that we provide for free. Love the show? Never want to miss the latest news? Sign up to our newsletter. The link is in the description, and get regular Napoleonic bulletins direct to your inbox. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars Pod merch. Again, the link is in the description. And did you know you can now gift memberships to Patreon perks that we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive meetups with authors, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of the perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out how you can join a buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying things like courses, socials, a book club, green room access to recordings, early releases, exclusive episodes, and much more besides. Their support is empowering us to vastly increase our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on an almost daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some more documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in January of 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, Robin Brasher, and Daniel Fieldman. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Moran, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.